She tried to stop me from saving a man's life. Welcome back to Reddit Chronicles. If you're new here, consider subscribing to help me feed my channel and grow my cat. And if you liked the video, do kindly give it a thumbs up to help me out. Let's get started. I worked in an emergency room, ER, for 6 years, so I'm full of stories, but when it comes to petty revenge, this one sticks out in my memory. P. Patient. PD. Patient's daughter. CP. Critical patient. Me. Every person who has worked in the ER knows that Mondays are the busiest days of the week, and also when all the crazies come out. This day was no different. I worked as a nurse in triage, where you initially get assessed in the front before going to the back. Here we determine who needs to go to the back first and who can wait. It's not a first come first serve basis as most people think. We had a few stretchers in the front for people who needed to be monitored a little closer or needed IVs, blood draws, labs, etc. There were 6 stretchers, but this day was so busy, all 6 stretchers were filled, plus 5 more in the hallway. This lady comes in on an ambulance, but because her symptoms did not indicate an emergency, she was placed in stretcher triage to wait her turn. She was in a lot of pain. After assessment, I recognized her symptoms as being caused from gallstones, painful but not life-threatening. We put her on a stretcher, started an IV, drew labs, and hooked her up to the monitor just in case. A few minutes later, patient's daughter comes in the front door. One look at her, and we knew she would cause problems. She had everything from the shoes to the haircut, a classic rich Karen. When she saw that her mom was still in the front and hadn't seen a doctor yet, she started screaming that she knew the CEO of the hospital and that we would all be fired if we didn't get her mom to the back to see a doctor right now. We explained that her mom has a history of gallstones, and even the patient herself was trying to explain that she had this pain many times because of the gallstones. We explained about being really busy and that there was no rooms available in the back, and we would get her back as soon as we could. She eventually calmed down, but was still antsy. About an hour later, another patient, critical patient, comes in and was put in the stretcher besides patient and patient's daughter. This patient had worrying complaints, but on initial assessment, we could not find anything wrong. Now, as a nurse, you learn to always trust your gut. When your gut sounds an alarm, you listen. Something about this patient was setting my alarm bells off, but all of his vitals were normal, and I had no solid evidence to declare him an emergency. I hooked him up to the monitor and kept a very close eye on him. I let the charge nurse know of my concerns, and she said to let her know as soon as something changes. Not 5 minutes later, something changed. Now at this time, I should explain that this hospital was a level 1 trauma center, meaning we get all the bad cases, from car crashes to gunshot victims. We were in the middle of gang territory. Since we had to be ready for any traumas, life-threatening injuries, we had a room with 3 beds that was closed off from the rest of the beds, because traumas usually involved a lot of people and a lot of blood. Even on busy days like this one, those rooms were empty unless there was a trauma patient. Now, back to critical patient. I was taking vital signs of patient when I looked over to critical patient. I noticed a worrying change in his rhythm and stopped with patient to start assessing critical patient to see what was going on. That did not sit well with patient's daughter. She actually grabbed my arm and told me to finish with her mom. I jerked my arm free and said I had to make sure critical patient was okay. As I turned around to critical patient, his rhythm went into VVIB, life-threatening rhythm. I called the charge nurse to inform her of critical patient's condition, all while unhooking critical patient from the monitor and throwing his bed into drive. As I started pushing him back, patient's daughter actually jumps in front of the stretcher and stops it. She's screaming that her mom was here first and needed to be seen before critical patient, and screaming that I was a liar and that she was going to get me fired. I'm usually a mild-tempered person, but knowing critical patient was literally minutes away from dying, and I said to patient's daughter, "You have a choice. Get out of my way or get run over," as I started pushing the stretcher forward. Now, I'm really good at pushing stretchers fast and getting the patients where they needed to go in a hurry, one of the reasons I was part of the trauma team. Patient's daughter tried to stand firm, but she saw I wasn't going to stop and jumped out of the way just as I was an inch from hitting her. Unfortunately, she did not move fast enough, and I ended up running over her foot. At this point, I didn't care and got the patient back to the trauma room, leaving patient's daughter screaming, lying on the floor. We spent about 30 minutes on critical patient, but he ended up dying. By the time I got back up front, patient and patient's daughter had been taken to the back to see a doctor, but my charge nurse warned me that they were filing a complaint against me. A few days later, the actual CEO of the hospital came to visit me on my next shift. He was known to be a kind and fair man. Since this happened during a time before cameras were put in, the ERs had to take what happened from the word of mouth. Apparently, patient's daughter said I assaulted her several times and put her mom's life in danger by not assessing her properly, and that I should be fired. Turns out patient did actually have gallstones and nothing else. Also, patient's daughter's foot was broken due to me running over it. I calmly explained exactly what happened and that patient's daughter's actions might have ended up in critical patient dying because of the delay she caused by her actions. When I got to the part of what I said to patient's daughter and running over her foot, the CEO actually started laughing and then tried to cover his mouth to hide his laughter. He explained that patient's daughter was a friend of his sister and that he knows what kind of person she is. Not only did I not get fired, he put a personal note in my file, praising my actions. On my next review, I got a large raise, plus a bonus, thanks to the CEO's note. Now that I read it out loud, I feel like it doesn't quite belong in petty revenge for some reason. If anyone happens to agree or disagree, let me know why you think so in the comments. CEO voids a verbal agreement. Enjoy the new union. Hey all, this is a long story which spans several years, but I look back at the outcome with fondness. 25 years ago, I worked 7 nights a week as a driver, subcontracted to the local newspaper to deliver bundles to stores and carriers. At 18, I was the youngest driver with his own route, having first been brought in by a family friend when I was 16 as a spare driver, then moving up. My days were spent at college studying computer science or working computer repair jobs. Verbal agreement gets voided. The rural route I was offered had the greatest number of kilometers, with a relatively lower number of newspapers compared to other routes. I made an agreement with the manager, bought a heavy-duty cargo van, which had been reconverted to run on propane, far cheaper back then got to work. Most other trucks would not have made a profit doing this route. After several months on the job, I was called into the office by the CEO of the distribution company, who was mad that I had been getting paid more for my kilometers in comparison to other in-city routes. The manager backed me up, saying he had okayed the rate to balance out the longer hours with fewer bundles. The CEO yelled at the manager in front of the whole office and asked if there was a signed contract to state the agreed terms. When the manager admitted it was a verbal contract, the CEO said then it didn't count and was void. Stuck with having to pay off the cargo van, and I really did enjoy the job itself, I kept at it, but documented everything, including all negotiations, calls asking me to come early, requests to set the order of my route, times waiting at press, times entering/leaving loading bay, who was before and after me, route completion times, return home times, fuel costs, kilometers driven, and press breakdowns. 6 months later, I wanted to take some time off, but was refused. None of the company's spares would agree to do my route since it costs them too much in time and fuel. Working 7 nights a week gets draining. I threatened to quit, and the company relented, agreeing to pay the spares more, but not me. This situation made me madder than ever, and I started reading. I get organizing. I learned of the magical difference between a dependent and an independent contractor, and how a dependent contractor is granted many of the same rights as employees, like overtime and holiday pay. I knew this was a temporary job for me, but I was pissed enough to devote a large amount of my time to make the owner pay. I filed a comprehensive personal employment standards complaint using all the records I had been keeping. Plus, I offered my records to around 10 other drivers who followed my lead into filing their own complaints. A key part of my records was proving how much control the company had on how we performed our jobs. Talk of unionizing was always in the background, but it was at this point I joined the cause with a fervor. We attracted one of the country's largest unions who devoted a fair amount of resources to backing us up even before they were voted in. My records went to the union, who referred to them consistently. Because I had years of spare experience, I also had in-depth knowledge of many of the other routes and the lopsided pay. I helped convince several of the other drivers to join up, including some of the spares. Forming a union is a long process, so be aware there were multiple votes interspersed with the events below, with each vote favoring the union position. There were also several other enthusiastic organizers who were tired of how things were. The company fights back. The company played hardball and went after us on multiple fronts. A number of union-friendly spares were fired. Drivers lost their routes due to strategic amalgamations, and I was let go under the excuse that I had less seniority than the CEO's son-in-law, who had worked as a spare a couple of times over the last few years. My own departure didn't last long. The newspaper itself demanded I be put back on my route, following major problems and delays from the son-in-law doing it. Bad drops, loads of complaints by carriers and customers. The union filed complaints to the labor board, calling it obvious union busting. I filed a complaint to the Employment Standards Tribunal, which had been set up for my personal case. Since the company had played the seniority card, it was determined I had greater security than a number of company men, given that I had worked as a spare since I was 16. The labor board said I should be given the opportunity to bump any of those with less seniority and take their route. Both the company and the union asked me to not pursue this if I agreed to an immediate increase to my current route and to be paid for all days missed. I agreed. Negotiations pay off. Now 2 years later from the start of my story, negotiations are still ongoing, but several interim agreements have been reached. A universal pay algorithm was agreed on, with drivers receiving back pay to when the negotiations started. I received one of the biggest checks. One thing I did not agree to was to let the union negotiate away my employment standards complaint. I was the lone holdout here, so as such, I had equal standing in some labor board tribunals with the CEO and union negotiators. I will always relish the disdain the CEO had for me at those meetings, to the point of placing his briefcase on the negotiating table to block my view of him, and me reclining back ever so slowly in those nice, comfy chairs to grin at him while offering water. The Employment Standards Tribunal determined I was a dependent contractor. They awarded me with everything I had asked for, and more, including penalties and interest. They made a point to mention how egregiously the company had behaved after the complaint had first been submitted. The dependent contractor determination greatly strengthened the union's position for future negotiations. I move on to my career and stake. I quit shortly afterwards since I had finished with college and was full into the tech world. It did take a couple more years for the company to finally agree to pay the full amount awarded. The CEO delayed it as long as he could. Every few months I refused lowball settlement offers. That final check with his personal signature paid off my student loans and a steak dinner. TLDR, CEO voids a verbal agreement, I get documenting, get fired, get rehired, win employment standards case, and help bring in a union. I also eat steak. Oh, I bet that steak tasted real good. If you want more where that came from, simply click on one of these boxes right here. And if you liked the video, I assume you did since you're still here, share it with your friends to see what they think. And of course, if you haven't already, click the kitty to subscribe and you'll never miss another video. I'll see you in the next episode of Reddit Chronicles.